In the summer of 1939, a peasant farmer in the Polish countryside looked up at a clear sky and saw specks on the horizon. He didn't know it yet, but he was one of the first people on Earth to witness the beginning of the deadliest conflict in human history. A war that would spread across 6 continents and every ocean. A war that would kill more people than any event before or since. 60, 70, by some estimates, 85 million human beings, and most of them were ordinary people who never wore a uniform. But here's the part almost everyone gets wrong. This war didn't begin on that summer morning. It didn't begin with a single gunshot. It began 20 years earlier in a gilded room full of exhausted diplomats who were convinced they were building a lasting peace. They thought they were ending a war. What they were actually doing was lighting a fuse. This is the story of how the world talked itself, step by step, into catastrophe. How a peace became a time bomb. How hunger pushed an entire nation into the arms of a monster. And how the greatest powers on the planet watched it all happen and chose, again and again, to do nothing. Welcome back to the channel. If you're into history told in depth, hit that subscribe button now, because this is a 10-part series, and each episode tells a piece of this enormous story. Let's start at the very beginning. November 11th, 1918, 11 in the morning. All along the Western Front, the guns finally fell silent. The First World War, what they called at the time, the war to end all wars, was over, and the toll was staggering. Nearly 17 million dead. An entire generation of young men fed into the meat grinder of the trenches. Empires that had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. And on top of all of it, a devastating flu swept the planet, killing millions more people already exhausted by war. Europe was on its knees. Months later, in June of 1919, the victors gathered at the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris, to decide what came next. And the mood in that place was not one of mercy, it was one of revenge. 3 men dominated the table. The Frenchman Georges Clemenceau, who had watched his country be invaded by Germany twice in barely a generation and who wanted one thing, to make sure Germany could never do it again. The Briton Lloyd George, torn between punishing the Germans and not destroying them completely. And the American Woodrow Wilson, an idealist who dreamed of a just peace and of a new international body that would make wars like this one impossible forever. The problem is that these 3 men wanted different things, and the result was a treaty that managed the worst combination possible, harsh enough to humiliate Germany, but not harsh enough to leave it unable to strike back. The terms were crushing. Germany was forced to accept, alone, the entire blame for the whole war, in a single clause, the notorious Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. And on the basis of that guilt, it was ordered to pay reparations of 132 billion gold marks. A sum so absurd that economists at the time warned it would take decades to pay and would suffocate the German economy in the process. And it didn't stop at money. Germany lost about 13% of its territory. The region of Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. A corridor of land was carved out to give the newly created Poland an outlet to the sea, cutting Germany into 2 pieces and turning the city of Danzig into a free city. Every German colony overseas was confiscated, and the army, cut down to a mere 100,000 men, banned from having tanks, banned from having submarines, banned from having an air force, and the Rhineland, the entire strip of border with France, would have to remain permanently demilitarized. To complete the humiliation, Germany wasn't even invited to negotiate. They simply handed over the finished document and told them to sign. The Germans called it a diktat, a dictated peace, an imposition. To the Allied leaders, all of this was justice. But to the average German, the shopkeeper, the factory worker, the soldier coming home from the front, it didn't feel like justice at all. It felt like a knife in the back. And that phrase isn't just a figure of speech. It turned quite literally into a poisonous political theory. Many Germans refused to believe their army had actually lost on the battlefield. After all, when the war ended, German troops were still standing on foreign soil, so they told themselves a comforting lie. We didn't lose the war, we were betrayed. Betrayed by cowardly politicians, by socialists, by scapegoats inside our own country. Historians call it the stab-in-the-back myth. Hold on to that idea, because a decade later, a failed artist with a terrifying talent for hatred would build an entire empire on top of it. And there was one last bitter irony. That international body Wilson dreamed so much about, the League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, was born weak right from the start. Because Wilson's own country, the United States, refused to join it. The American Senate rejected the treaty. So the institution that was supposed to keep world peace began its life without the most powerful nation on the planet. Hold on to that detail too. It's going to matter a great deal. Out of the ruins of the old German Empire, with the Kaiser deposed and in exile, a new experiment was born, the Weimar Republic, Germany's first serious attempt at democracy, and on paper, it had one of the most advanced and progressive constitutions in the entire world. The problem is that it was born into absolute chaos. In its first years, the streets of German cities became battlegrounds. Far-right paramilitary groups, the so-called Freikorps, hunted and killed left-wing revolutionaries. Communist uprisings were crushed with brutality. There were attempted coups from both sides, and moderate politicians, people who were only trying to make the young democracy work, were assassinated in broad daylight. For a huge number of Germans, the new republic was stained from birth, tied to defeat, to the humiliation of Versailles, and to disorder. And then, in 1923, came the blow that broke the spine of the people's confidence. Germany fell behind on a reparations payment. In response, France and Belgium invaded and occupied the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the country. The German government called on workers to resist passively, stop producing, and to fund all of it, began printing money non-stop. The result was one of the most surreal economic catastrophes in history: hyperinflation. Prices didn't rise, they exploded. They doubled and then doubled again, sometimes within the same afternoon. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks before the war came to cost billions of marks. People were paid twice a day and rushed out to spend everything immediately, because if they waited until nightfall, their wages would be worth nothing. Workers carried their pay in wheelbarrows and laundry baskets, mountains of banknotes. There were photos of children playing with bundles of money stacked like building blocks. Families discovered it was cheaper to burn the bills in the stove than to use them to buy firewood. And most devastating of all, the middle class, the people who had worked their whole lives and saved with discipline, watched everything evaporate overnight. Pensioners were left in poverty, a lifetime of savings turned into worthless paper. And a lesson was burned into the souls of millions of Germans: the institutions will not protect you. Democracy will not save you. Germany did manage to get back on its feet. A skilled politician named Gustav Stresemann stabilized the currency with a bold reform. And, crucially, American loans began pouring into the country through an international agreement. With that money came a recovery. For a few golden years in the mid-1920s, Berlin flourished. It became one of the most vibrant and creative capitals in the world. Cabarets, jazz, cinema, avant-garde art. It seemed the worst was over, but all that prosperity rested on a dangerous foundation: borrowed money from abroad. mostly from the United States. It was a house of cards built on American credit, and across the Atlantic, someone was about to kick the table. October 1929, the New York stock market collapsed. It's the moment history records as the start of the Great Depression, and it did not stay confined to the United States. The global economy of that era worked like a chain of interlocking links, and when the strongest link snapped, all the others came down with it. Banks failed, international trade collapsed, and remember those American loans propping up the German recovery? They were cut off and called back almost overnight. Investors in the United States, desperate, pulled their money back home, and Germany, still fragile, still full of scars, went into freefall. In 1931, the German banking system collapsed, and unemployment exploded. We're not talking about small numbers. By 1932, around 6 million Germans were out of work. That's nearly a third of the entire workforce of the country, with no job, no income, no hope. Think about what that means in practice. Fathers who couldn't put food on the table for their children. Men who had survived the hell of the trenches, now begging on street corners. Enormous lines of people waiting for a bowl of soup. An entire nation plunged into fear and humiliation for the second time in a single generation. And here it's worth noting something a lot of people forget. German democracy was already dying before Hitler ever came to power. The governments of the time, unable to deal with the crisis, began ruling by emergency decree, bypassing parliament. The democratic rules were already being hollowed out from the inside, and it's precisely there, in that kind of soil, fear, hunger, humiliation, and a shrinking faith in democracy, that extreme ideas flourish. When people are frightened enough, when they're desperate enough, they stop looking for good leaders, they start looking for angry ones. They want someone who will point a finger at a villain and say, with absolute conviction, this is who did it to you. In 1930, in a nation with millions of people on the edge of the abyss, there was a man waiting to say exactly that. Before we meet this man up close, if this deep dive is holding your attention so far, do me a quick favor and drop a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who love real history, told without the rush and without dumbing it down. Deal? Then let's talk about the man who would become the most dangerous of the 20th century. Adolf Hitler was not on paper an impressive man. He wasn't even German by birth, he was Austrian. In his youth, he dreamed of being an artist and tried to get into a fine arts academy in Vienna. He was rejected, twice. He spent years living off odd jobs and selling mediocre paintings, immersed in a city where he absorbed, like a sponge, the most toxic anti-Semitic ideas of the age. When the First World War broke out, he enlisted with enthusiasm and served as a simple corporal, a messenger at the front. He was decorated for bravery, and he was wounded, temporarily blinded by a chemical gas attack. It was while recovering, in a hospital, that he got the news of the German surrender. For Hitler, that was not a military defeat, it was a personal betrayal. He never forgave it. And he made that resentment the fuel for everything that came after. After the war, he joined a tiny, insignificant party in Munich, and it was there that he discovered his one true talent, speaking in public. He was, whatever else you say about him, a terrifyingly effective orator, able to hypnotize an entire room, to turn the diffuse anger of a crowd into a sharpened weapon. In 1923, carried away by that power, he made a mistake. He tried to seize power by force in a chaotic, clumsy coup that began inside a beer hall in Munich. The coup failed humiliatingly, and he was thrown in prison. Most people at the time would have said his political career ended right there. but prison was actually his springboard. While locked up in a comfortable cell, he wrote a book, a rambling, hate-filled manifesto in which he laid out, hiding nothing, his entire worldview, the genocidal anti-Semitism, the obsession with racial purity, and the idea that Germany needed living space, territory to be conquered by force in Eastern Europe, even if it cost the lives of millions. It was all there, written in plain sight, years before it happened. And when he got out of prison, he completely changed his strategy. No more coups. He would take power the legal way, through the vote, through the ballot box, and he would use democracy itself as a tool to destroy it from within. He rebuilt the party from the ground up with a propaganda machine that was revolutionary for its time. Massive rallies, choreographed like spectacles, aggressive use of the radio. He even flew across the country to give speeches in several cities on the same day, something unheard of. And he had a private army of brown-shirted thugs, the SA, who spread violence in the streets and then presented themselves as the only ones capable of restoring order. And his message was simple, and it's precisely because it was simple that it worked so well. To a country drowning in shame and unemployment, he offered pride. He promised to tear the Treaty of Versailles to shreds. He promised jobs, bread, and the restoration of national glory. And, above all, he gave people someone to hate. The politicians who signed the armistice, the communists, and, at the very center of his message, a monstrous, murderous hatred against Germany's Jewish population. And it worked in a terrifying way. Look at the progression. In 1928, before the crisis, the Nazi Party had a little under 3% of the vote, a footnote, irrelevant. Then came the Great Depression. In 1930, the Nazis jumped to 18%. And in July of 1932, at the bottom of the economic crisis, they became the largest party in all of Germany, with more than a third of the vote. Misery had been the fuel. The worse people's lives got, the higher the party climbed. Even so, the final push was still missing, and it didn't come from the ballot box, it came from behind closed doors. A group of traditional conservative politicians, arrogant men, thought they could use Hitler as a puppet. Their plan was simple: put him in a high office, use his popularity to control the masses, and keep him on a leash. "We've hired him," said one of them, "and within 2 months we'll have him squeezed into a corner till he squeaks." And so, on the 30th of January, 1933, President Hindenburg, an elderly field marshal, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. He did not storm into power with tanks. They handed him the keys. And those clever men who swore they'd control him, they would discover far too quickly the size of their mistake. They controlled nothing at all. Hitler moved with a speed that caught everyone off guard. Less than a month after taking office, on the night of February 27, 1933, the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, went up in flames. To this day, there's debate over who exactly set that fire, but what matters is what Hitler did with it. The Nazis immediately blamed the communists and shouted that it was the beginning of a revolution. The next day, taking advantage of the panic, they convinced the old president to sign an emergency decree suspending basic civil liberties: freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, protection from arbitrary arrest, all of it at once. That was the first great step. The second came a few weeks later. Under intimidation and violence, Parliament passed a law giving Hitler the power to make laws by himself, without Parliament, without checks, without balances. With a single vote, German democracy, the very one born from the ashes of the previous war, was legally switched off. And what followed was fast and merciless. Every other political party was banned. The unions were crushed. The free press ceased to exist. And the first concentration camps were opened, beginning to fill with political prisoners, opponents, anyone who dared to resist. But there was still one threat to Hitler's absolute power, and it came from inside the Nazi movement itself. The brown-shirted thugs, the SA, had grown too large and too violent, and their leader had ambitions of his own. So, in the summer of 1934, Hitler had his own allies executed in a bloody purge that became known as the Night of the Long Knives. SA leaders and various political enemies were murdered without trial. It was a clear message to all of Germany. No one, absolutely no one, was safe. Weeks later, the old president Hindenburg died, and Hitler simply merged the offices of president and chancellor into himself, taking a new title, Führer, supreme leader. And then came the most sinister detail of all. The German armed forces were forced to swear a new oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but personally to Adolf Hitler. In a little over a year and a half, a man who had been appointed through political maneuvering had become the absolute dictator of an entire nation. And Germany was not alone in the world. This was a decade when strongmen, authoritarian, militaristic, were rising to power in every corner of the planet. With his power secured at home, Hitler began to look outward, at the borders Versailles had drawn against him. He reintroduced compulsory military service, tearing up the treaty. He began openly building an air force, the Luftwaffe, something that was strictly forbidden. And with every violation he watched, is anyone going to react? Is anyone going to stop me? The answer, again and again, would be no. In Italy, the model was already set. Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement had seized power more than a decade earlier, glorifying violence, empire, and the absolute authority of the state. Hitler openly admired him and took inspiration from him. And in 1935, Mussolini decided to build his own empire by invading Ethiopia, one of the few African countries still independent. The League of Nations, that same body meant to prevent exactly this kind of aggression, faced a crucial test, and it failed shamefully. It passed weak sanctions, full of loopholes, that prevented nothing. Ethiopia was conquered, and the whole world learned a dangerous lesson. The League was a paper tiger. It could roar, but it had no teeth. On the other side of the planet, the same rot advanced. The Empire of Japan, dominated by a military caste hungry for raw materials and territory, had already invaded the region of Manchuria in northern China back in 1931, setting up a puppet state there. When the League of Nations timidly condemned it, Japan simply walked out of the League and pressed on. And in 1937, it launched a full and staggeringly brutal invasion of China itself. The atrocities committed in that campaign, especially in the city of Nanking, are among the most horrific of the century. In a sense, the Second World War had already begun in Asia, years before the fighting reached the heart of Europe. These regimes began to draw closer to one another. Germany and Italy formed an alliance. Germany and Japan signed a pact against communism, and when a civil war broke out in Spain, Hitler and Mussolini sent planes and soldiers to back the authoritarian side, using that conflict as a real laboratory to test their new weapons and tactics. It was there, in a small Spanish town called Guernica, that the world got one of its first glimpses of the horror to come. An entire town, full of civilians, deliberately bombed from the sky until it was rubble. It was a rehearsal for what would happen to all of Europe. Now Hitler began to test the limits of the West directly. His first great gamble came in 1936, when he ordered his troops to march back into the Rhineland, that strip of border with France that under the treaty was supposed to stay demilitarized forever. It was an enormously risky bluff. The German army was still weak, and Hitler's own generals were terrified. They had secret orders to retreat immediately at the first sign of French resistance. If France had reacted with force at that moment, it's very likely Germany would have retreated in humiliation, and history might have taken a different turn. But France and Britain, once again, did absolutely nothing. And why not? Here it's important to understand, without excusing it. The leaders of Britain and France were not idiots or cowards by nature. They were men marked deeply by the trauma of the First World War. They had watched an entire generation die in the trenches, and they were willing to do almost anything, to keep that from happening again. On top of that, many of them believed, deep down, that the Treaty of Versailles had been unjust and far too harsh on Germany, and that maybe Hitler's demands had some basis. So a strategy was born, with a name that would go down in history as a synonym for failure: appeasement. The belief that if you kept handing the bully pieces, one at a time, he would eventually be satisfied and stop on his own. And Hitler exploited that hope to the bone. In March of 1938, he marched his troops into Austria and annexed the entire country, the so-called Union, the Anschluss. The world protested and did nothing. Next, he turned his eyes to Czechoslovakia, demanding a border region called the Sudetenland, where a large German-speaking population lived. And here we arrive at one of the most infamous moments in all of modern history. At a conference in the city of Munich in late 1938, the leaders of Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, simply handed that region over to Hitler. They negotiated the surrender of a piece of Czechoslovakia without a single Czech representative even being allowed into the room. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, came home, stepped off the plane waving the paper of the agreement, and triumphantly announced to the crowd that he had secured peace for our time. Most of the public celebrated, relieved, but not everyone believed it. One lonely voice in the British Parliament, a politician seen at the time as an alarmist and out of fashion, named Winston Churchill, warned coldly, "You were given a choice between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor, and you will have war anyway." And just weeks after Munich, the mask came off for good. In a single night in November of 1938, all across Germany, synagogues were set on fire, the storefronts of Jewish shops were smashed, and thousands of people were arrested simply for being who they were. The world saw, with absolute clarity, the true nature of that regime, and still, few acted. Then, in March of 1939, Hitler took the step that finally killed the fantasy of appeasement. He tore up the very agreement he had signed in Munich and swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. This had nothing to do with uniting Germans anymore. It was pure and simple conquest. Finally, too late, Britain and France woke up. They declared the policy of appeasement over and publicly promised that, if Poland were attacked, they would go to war. And then came the twist that almost no one, anywhere in the world, had predicted. In August of 1939, the two greatest ideological enemies of Europe, Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, regimes that publicly hated each other and presented themselves as absolute opposites, shocked the planet by signing a pact. On the surface, it was just a promise not to attack each other, but there was a secret protocol, hidden from the world, in which the two coldly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between themselves, like carving up a cake, and the first name on that list of division, the first course of that feast, was Poland. With that agreement, Hitler had eliminated his greatest fear, fighting on two fronts at the same time. Now he was free to attack, stop and think about everything that had to happen to get here: the crushing reparations of Versailles, the humiliation of an entire people, the collapse of hyperinflation, the Great Depression, mass unemployment, a democracy dying from within, the rise of a dictator who announced his intentions out loud, in writing, years in advance. And year after year, in which the great powers of the world looked the other way, handed over one more piece, and hoped the problem would solve itself. All of it converged on this single point. The fuse that had been lit in that gilded room at Versailles 20 years earlier had finally burned all the way down. And on the 1st of September 1939, at dawn, that Polish peasant farmer from the beginning of our story looked up again at the clear sky. Only this time, the specks on the horizon were bigger. They were closer, and the drone of engines filled the air. The storm the world had spent 20 years building, piece by piece, mistake by mistake, had finally arrived. That's exactly where we begin in the next episode, with the invasion that turned Europe's long, slow fall into all-out war, and with a terrifying new way of fighting, so fast and so brutal that the world had never seen anything like it. It had a name: Blitzkrieg. The Lightning War. That's episode 2. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, do you think the Second World War could have been avoided if the world had acted in time? See you in the next episode.